Evelyn Evie Monroe knew, scientifically, that water was supposed to be clear. The water pooling in the ancient copper gutter above the door of the crooked spine, however, was the color of weak tea and carried the distinct aroma of wet dog and disappointment. She hadn't been back to Havenwood Creek, Oregon, since she was 12, and she'd spent the last 20 years successfully avoiding the place. Now, at 32, she was standing beneath the perpetually drizzling sky, clutching the massive iron key to a bookstore she didn't want, located in a town she actively resented. Evelyn, a woman who had once navigated Manhattan's publishing scene wearing 5-inch heels and the perfectly tailored air of expensive exhaustion, currently looked like a highly caffeinated casualty. Her expensive leather suitcase was currently resting in a 2-inch puddle of what she sincerely hoped was just rainwater. "It's temporary," she muttered to the oversized, moss-covered porch gnome that served as the shop's mascot. 3 months, tops. Sell, settle, sanitize, and back to civilization. The irony was that she hadn't come here to sanitize. She'd come here because she was the mess. A year ago, she was a rising star at Oakhaven Press. 6 months ago, she was the editor who championed The Last Testament of Amelia Frost, which turned out to be an expertly plagiarized collection of obscure Hungarian folk tales. The resulting scandal was spectacular, sinking her career faster than a bad review in the New York Times. Havenwood Creek wasn't a sabbatical. It was witness protection for disgraced literary figures. She fumbled with the key, pushing the heavy oak door inward with a groan. The interior hit her with a sensory triple whammy. Damp air, the thick, musty scent of 1,000 unread paperbacks, and the faint, sweet trace of Aunt Bee's famously terrible jasmine tea. The shop was less charming vintage and more fire hazard. Books were piled on tables, stacked in teetering columns on the floor, and wedged horizontally into shelves clearly designed for vertical storage. Evie spotted a taxidermied squirrel wearing a tiny tweed bow tie perched on the cash register. This, she thought, is why the real estate agent laughed. She dropped her suitcase with a sigh that echoed in the gloom. The first task was to find the fuse box and conquer the darkness. The second, more pressing task was to locate the source of a distinct thump-thump-thump sound coming from the ceiling. It sounded less like structural damage and more like a disgruntled pigeon having a small, rhythmic temper tantrum. Evie pulled out her phone, 0 bars naturally, and used the flashlight to navigate the labyrinth. She found a narrow, rickety staircase labeled "Private, unless you're B," which, given that B was deceased, felt sufficiently private. The second floor was worse. It was Aunt Bee's apartment, and it was a glorious shrine to clutter. A vintage record player was skipping on the floor, causing the thumping noise. Evie stepped over a basket of yarn, a pile of maps, and a dusty globe. She found the breaker box near a tiny peeling door marked "Rooftop Access, Caution, Gulls." She flipped the main switch. The lights flickered on, buzzing loudly. Mission accomplished. But just as the relative safety of electricity washed over her, a deep, resonant voice boomed from the stairwell. "Ma'am, you can't be up here. This whole section is flagged." Evie spun around. Standing at the top of the stairs, filling the entire doorway with his alarming presence, was the enormous, rugged man she had ever seen outside of an overly ambitious lumberjack calendar. He was wearing heavy-duty pants, a gray fire department hoodie that strained across his chest, and an expression of controlled, professional annoyance. His dark hair was damp from the constant drizzle, and his jaw was set in a way that suggested she had just personally ruined his Tuesday. This was Jake Tanner, Chief Fire Chief, and as Evie would soon learn, the physical manifestation of Havenwood Creek's rigid stability. "Flagged," Evie said, holding her phone light up to the room, attempting to look authoritative despite standing next to a mountain of mismatched slippers. "Flagged for what, exactly? Excessive charm?" "It's flagged for structural compromise," Jake stated flatly, stepping cautiously onto the wooden floor. His movements were careful, precise. "I'm Chief Tanner. I was called about an illegal power draw at this address." "Illegal power draw?" Evie echoed, feeling the heat rise in her cheeks. "It's a bookstore, not a crystal meth lab. I just inherited it. I'm Evelyn Monroe, and as of 5 minutes ago, I am the rightful, if bewildered, owner of this, property." Jake's eyes, the color of the deep, cold Oregon rivers, traveled slowly from her tailored linen shirt, now wrinkled, to the exposed wiring near the breaker. He looked entirely unconvinced. Great Aunt Bee kept a Renergator running for a week after her main power was shut down last month. She called it Sustainable Off-Grid Literary Enterprise. We call it Hazardous Code Violation. "Ah," Evie said weakly. "That sounds like Bee. You tripped the main breaker by overloading the system when you flipped the switch. And this floor," he tapped his boot heel on the floor, causing a faint shift in the towering stack of books nearby. "It needs a minimum of 4 joist reinforcements before you should be storing anything heavier than, say, knitting needles up here. Certainly not full-grown editors from New York." Evie felt a sting. "I'm not an editor anymore, Chief. I'm a small business owner who is currently trying to figure out why a taxidermied squirrel is looking at me like I owe him rent." Jake didn't smile. He didn't even twitch. He simply reached out and plucked the ancient record player from the floor, neatly coiled the cord around it. "I'll kill the power again while I check the wiring in the back storage area. Do not turn the main back on until I clear it." "Wait! You're going to check the wiring?" Evie started, following him. "Isn't that an electrician's job?" "In Havenwood Creek," he said over his shoulder, descending the precarious stairs with the grace of a man who dealt with falling debris professionally. "The fire chief is also the de facto electrical inspector, emergency plumber, and lead organizer of the Timber Festival. It's a very diversified portfolio." He paused at the bottom, his broad back to her, and his last comment hung in the air, heavy and decisive. "And Miss Monroe, if you plan on running a business here, you need to understand that safety and structure come before literary enterprise. We don't do chaos in Havenwood Creek." Evie watched the enormous back disappear into the shadows of the main floor. She felt suddenly small, judged, and incredibly cold. She looked down at the pile of yarn, and then at the broken floorboards. "Oh, Chief Tanner," she whispered to the empty room, a sliver of her old New York spite surfacing. "You have no idea how much chaos I can generate." She had 3 months to sell the shop. The stoic, frustratingly handsome fire chief just became the first obstacle on her long, damp road back to failure. Evie sat stiffly in the office of Silas Gentry, attorney at law, located above the only dry cleaner in Havenwood Creek. The office decor was precisely what one would expect from a small-town lawyer who hadn't updated his surroundings since Reagan was in office. Wood paneling, a calendar featuring puppies rescuing kittens, and an air conditioner that sounded like a washing machine full of gravel. Silas Gentry, a man whose tweed jacket was as thick as his paperwork, cleared his throat for the 3rd time. "And finally, Ms. Monroe, we arrive at the matter of the crooked spine and the remainder of Beatrice's estate." Evie smoothed her skirt, which felt utterly inappropriate for the humidity. She glanced at the chair beside her. It was occupied by none other than Chief Jake Tanner. He wasn't in his official fire chief hoodie today, but a flannel shirt that did nothing to diminish the alarming breadth of his shoulders. He was reading a pamphlet titled 50 Ways to Secure Your Roof Against High Wind Loads, with the intensity of a scholar dissecting ancient Greek philosophy. "If I may ask, Chief Tanner," Evie whispered, leaning closer to Silas, "why is he here? Is this some sort of preemptive code enforcement stakeout?" "I'm the designated executor for any matters pertaining to the annual Timber Festival." Silas Gentry chuckled, a dry, hacking sound that reminded Evie of the taxidermied squirrel back at the shop. Indeed, B was very clear on the interconnectedness of her affairs and the town's well-being, a rather progressive clause. Get to the clause, Silas, Jake advised, his voice measured. Right. While the contents of the bookstore and the attached apartment are entirely yours, Ms. Monroe, the deed to the property itself is held in a temporary trust created by your great-aunt B. Evie felt a familiar cold dread settle in her stomach. A temporary trust? Precisely, Silas beamed, as if he'd just announced she'd won the lottery. B was, as you know, deeply devoted to the cultural continuity of Havenwood Creek, and nothing, truly nothing, symbolizes that continuity like the annual Timber Festival. He paused for dramatic effect, allowing the rattling of the air conditioner to fill the silence. Therefore, the deed to the Crooked Spine cannot be sold, transferred, or put on the market for a period of 1 calendar year from the date of her passing. Evie leaned forward, gripping the arms of the chair. 1 year? That's impossible. My life is in New York. I need to liquidate this asset and move on. Unless, Silas chirped, pointing a triumphant, slightly yellowed finger, unless the following 2 conditions are met within the next 6 months. Evie waited, breath held. She imagined a scavenger hunt, or maybe having to knit a 3-legged llama sweater, something manageable and weirdly bee-like. Silas read in a sing-song voice. First condition, Evelyn Monroe must reside continuously in the above property apartment, personally operating the Crooked Spine as a functional establishment for a minimum of 180 days. Fine, Evie bit out. I could manage 6 months of self-imposed exile. And the second? Silas smiled broadly at Jake. Second condition. The annual Havenwood Creek Timber Festival, scheduled for 4 months from now, must be successfully executed, and, this is the crucial part, Jake, it must show a profit margin of at least 15% for the town coffers. Evie blinked. Wait, what does her bookstore have to do with the town's logging party? Everything, Ms. Monroe, Silas said gently. B believed that if the town thrived, her bookstore would thrive. She was quite insistent. If the festival is a success, the trust immediately dissolves and you receive the deed free and clear. Evie looked from the grinning lawyer to the stony-faced fire chief. And if it isn't a success? Then the trust continues for the full year, Jake said, finally lowering his pamphlet. His voice was devoid of emotion, making the pronouncement sound like a geological inevitability. The Timber Festival hasn't made a 15% profit margin in over 7 years, Ms. Monroe. Evie stared at him, horror dawning. So you're saying my ability to reclaim my life, pay off my debts, and escape this place hinges on a local fair that consistently loses money? It hinges, Jake corrected, folding the pamphlet neatly. It hinges on the collective effort of the community, of which you are now officially a part. No, absolutely not, Evie protested, standing abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the wood paneling. I'm an editor. I deal with words, deadlines, and contracts. I don't coordinate community events involving axes, lumberjacks, and presumably enormous fire risks. I manage the fire risks, Jake assured her, standing up, which somehow made the office shrink significantly. And as the lead organizer for the festival committee, I can assure you that the key to success is, ironically, structure, planning, and rigid adherence to tradition. He paused, his gaze locking with hers. Which brings us to the real problem, Ms. Monroe. B also stipulated that as the property's current beneficiary, you must take on the role of festival marketing and events coordinator. Evie's jaw dropped. The thought of pairing her highly stressed, detail-oriented existence with a man who viewed fun as a controlled burn, all while being financially tied to a failing logging jamboree, was pure torture. "She made me work for you?" Evie squeaked, aghast. "She made us work together," Jake corrected, his expression softening into something that Evie couldn't quite decipher, a mixture of annoyance and perhaps a hint of amused resignation. "The first committee meeting is Thursday evening at the fire station. Bring ideas, but please, no crystal meth labs or generators." Evie watched him leave, the pamphlet tucked neatly into his back pocket. She sank back into the chair, clutching her temples. She was trapped in a soggy, chaotic bookstore, tied by a bizarre will to a profitable small-town festival, and shackled to the town's only unsmiling, incredibly handsome authority figure. "Well, Silas," Evie sighed, running her hair through her hair, "it appears Great Aunt Bee didn't leave me an inheritance. She left me a full-time, unpaid sentence." Silas merely shrugged, reaching for a file marked Tanner Family Trust. "Bee just always said, if you want to leave Havenwood Creek, you have to earn your way out. And you can't earn anything without a little sweat and a good axe-throwing competition."
3 days after the disastrous lawyer meeting, Evie had established a tenuous foothold in Havenwood Creek. She was residing in the apartment above the Crooked Spawn, which meant she was sleeping 5 feet above the world's most extensive collection of outdated travel guides, and she smelled faintly of mildew and jasmine tea. Her first act as proprietor was cleaning. She'd managed to clear a small path through the main floor, and, most critically, she had disconnected the taxidermied squirrel from the cash register. Its name, according to a small laminated note, was Barnaby, and he was apparently a silent literary muse. That Thursday evening, Evie arrived at the Havenwood Creek Fire Station precisely at 6:58 p.m. for the inaugural Timber Festival Committee meeting. If she was going to be forced into this, she would be punctual, professional, and mercilessly efficient. The fire station was aggressively clean and smelled faintly of pine sol and competence, a stark contrast to her own establishment. The meeting was held in a stark room dominated by a long folding table. Jake Tanner, looking predictably solid in a freshly ironed uniform shirt, stood at the head of the table, already projecting an aura of control. Seated around him were about 10 people, comprising roughly a fifth of the town's adult population. They were a diverse, fleece-wearing, and deeply familiar bunch. Evie recognized a few faces, notably Mrs. Gable, a kindly woman who had dropped off a triple-layer zucchini bread for her to help you settle. Jake rapped a knuckle on the table. "All right, welcome. Evie, glad you could make it. This is the 2024 Timber Festival Committee. We'll keep this brief." He introduced the members: the mayor, a sweet man who seemed perpetually worried about his prize-winning tomatoes; the owner of the single diner, Betty; and a quiet, imposing man named Doug, who was in charge of the official lumberjack competitions. "And as you all know," Jake continued, his gaze flicking to Evie and then quickly away, "Evelyn Monroe is filling B's role as marketing and events coordinator. She brings a fresh perspective from outside." Evie, who felt like a lab specimen, gave a tight, professional smile. "Jake, honey," Betty, the diner owner, chimed in, "does that mean she's going to fix the website? That thing looks like something my grandson made in 1998. "It was something her grandson made in 1998, Betty. "But yes, Evie?" Evie straightened her spine. This was her wheelhouse. She pulled out a pristine, organized binder filled with color-coded tabs. "Thank you," she began, projecting her voice slightly. "I have spent the last 3 days analyzing your past 5-year financials, which, I must say, are a bit chaotic, and the core problem is brand identity and activation. The Timber Festival is operating at a deficit because you're attracting local traffic when you need destination visitors." She flipped a page. "My plan is a 3-pronged strategy. 1. Digital overhaul.
We're building a responsive website, launching targeted social media ads. Instagram and TikTok are key for the authentic experience tourism demographic. 2. Press kits. I'm contacting my former colleagues in Portland and Seattle travel media. We need a professional angle. Havenwood Creek, where the axes are sharp and the coffee is strong. And 3. Premium eventing. We need a high-ticket item, perhaps a lumberjack gourmet dinner catered by a visiting celebrity chef. A beat of silence hung in the air, broken only by the hum of the fire station's fluorescent lights. Evie waited for the applause, or at least the impressed murmurs. Instead, Mrs. Gable slowly raised her hand. "But dear, who's going to staff the TikTok?" "We'll hire a freelancer from Portland," Evie suggested, already factoring the expense into her projected, non-existent budget. Doug, the competition organizer, folded his massive arms. "A freelancer? From Portland? That's a day's wage right there. And what about the traditional events, the log rolling and the beard competition?" "We keep them, of course, but we frame them cinematically. We need a professional photographer to capture the rugged authenticity." Jake finally spoke, leaning forward with his elbows on the table. His expression was not angry, but deeply, disappointingly skeptical. "Miss Monroe," he said, his voice quiet but commanding the room instantly, "our budget last year for all marketing, the entire budget, was $400. That covered the printed flyers we put up at the gas station and the church bulletin board. Your premium eventing alone would cost us 3 times the festival's total revenue." Evie felt her New York veneer crack. "But you're losing money. You have to spend money to make money." "We are making money," Jake corrected her, holding up a small, handwritten ledger. "Last year, we made $8,000. We spent $7,800. Our profit margin was 2.5%. Your goal is 15%. That's an additional $950 we need to clear. We do not need a celebrity chef or paid influencers. We need slightly cheaper paper for the flyers and maybe one more vendor selling locally sourced maple candy." He pushed the ledger across the table toward her. It was filled with meticulous, handwritten notes, not spreadsheet rows, but tiny, precise penmanship detailing every hot dog bun purchased and every parking fee collected. "The Timber Festival is about community, Evie," Jake said her first name for the first time, and the familiarity felt strange and unsettling. "It funds the fire department's volunteer EMT training. We do not risk our safety budget on authentic experience tourism. We stick to what works: tradition, thrift, and the support of the locals." Evie looked at the ledger, then at the earnest, expectant faces of the committee. They weren't fighting her. They were terrified she would break their beloved rickety tradition with her expensive city ideas. She took a deep breath, fighting the urge to tell them that their tradition was a financial death trap. "Fine," she conceded, pulling back her binder. "No TikTok, no celebrity chef. But we have to do something new to reach that 15%. "We're listening," Jake said, his voice flat, but the subtle shift in the room told her she had just passed a small initial test. Evie stared at the handwritten ledger. She had to find $950 extra without risking the EMT budget or hiring a freelancer. She looked up and met Jake's eye. His challenge was clear: prove you belong here, or fail and wait a year. "Okay," Evie said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her face, the smile that used to terrify junior editors. "If we can't outsource, we have to leverage what we have, starting with the crooked spine." She tapped her pen on the table. "This festival is about timber. We need a literary tie-in, a signature event that's cheap and draws high engagement. Forget influencers. We're going to run the Havenwood Creek short story contest, Tales of the Timber, and the prize is a free night at my apartment above the bookstore. And we're going to sell coffee and scones at the festival grounds." Jake's eyebrows lifted just slightly. It was the first human expression she had witnessed from him. "A story contest?" Betty frowned. "A literary booth?" Doug grumbled. Aunt Bee always used to say that nothing sells tickets like a good story, Evie said, meeting Jake's steady gaze. And if we can't bring the people to the event, Chief, we bring the event to the people, starting with a slightly functional bookstore and a ridiculously competitive short story prize. Evie's first week running the Crooked Spine confirmed two things. First, that her great-aunt Bee had a truly global network of creditors, and second, that Havenwood Creek residents were excellent conversationalists, but terrible book buyers. She'd managed to organize the romance section, mostly dusty harlequins and a disturbing number of books, and she'd rigged a coffee station in the corner using Bee's enormous, slightly temperamental commercial espresso machine. The machine was her main source of revenue. The locals, addicted to caffeine and gossip, flowed in early, ordered the Bee Special, a latte so strong it could dissolve enamel, and then proceeded to ignore the shelves entirely. Friday morning was typically her busiest. Evie, sweating slightly in the damp air, was battling the temperamental steam wand when a familiar, imposing figure blocked the weak sunlight filtering through the front window. It was Jake Tanner, looking less like a fire chief and more like a man who enjoyed physical labor. Wearing worn jeans and a thick, dark green t-shirt that advertised a long-gone logging competition. He carried a heavy-duty tool bag and a length of freshly milled lumber over his shoulder. "Chief Tanner," Evie said, her voice tight. "You're off duty, I assume, or is the presence of the taxidermied squirrel now a health hazard?" He stepped inside, the temperature of the room dropping 10 degrees. "The squirrel, Barnaby, is a landmark, Evie. He's fine. The floor above you, however, is not. I'm here about the joist reinforcement." Evie remembered his warning from their first encounter. "Right, the structural compromise. I was going to call a contractor." "I am the contractor," Jake said simply. "Or, at least, I do all the big carpentry for the town. I owe Bee a favor. Something about retrieving a miniature poodle from a drainage pipe back in 19. He set down the lumber, and the rhythmic sound of solid wood hitting solid wood grounded the chaotic room. He pulled a tape measure from his belt and moved toward the back staircase, his presence instantly overwhelming the narrow aisle between true crime and gardening. "I need to access the crawl space and the structural beam in the subfloor," he explained without looking back. "It'll take a few hours. Just try not to run any heavy machinery or host a dance party." "Duly noted," Evie mumbled, returning to the espresso machine. She poured herself a shot of pure caffeine and watched him go. The thump of his tools and the low sound of a circular saw starting up beneath her feet was strangely comforting in the otherwise silent, damp shop. About an hour later, the shop was empty, and Evie was trying to enter 3 days of sales into a spreadsheet. She heard Jake emerge from the back access panel. "It's worse than I thought," he stated, wiping a bead of sweat from his temple with the back of his massive, dust-covered hand. Evie looked up, momentarily distracted by the sight of him. His t-shirt was now clinging slightly in the damp air, and the fine layer of sawdust dusting his dark hair and strong arms gave him a rugged, almost mythical appearance. She realized, with a sudden, unprofessional jolt, that he was genuinely breathtaking when he wasn't actively judging her life choices. "Worse how?" she asked, trying to sound purely professional. "The main beam is water damaged, not just settling. Bee had a slow leak from the upstairs tub for years, and it compromised the core structural integrity," he explained, leaning on the counter. "Too close. Too big. I can brace the joists, but the beam needs replacement, or at least significant sistering. It's a bigger job. I'll need to work on it over the next couple of afternoons." I felt panic rise. "Jake, I can't afford that kind of expense. The entire point of the festival is to make money to pay off Bee's ridiculous debts, not create new ones." He looked at me, his river-colored eyes serious. "I'm not charging you, Evie." "You have to charge me," I insisted, leaning back slightly. This is professional work. You can't just fix half the town for free. I don't. I fix the fire station, the library, and B's property. It's the least I can do. B was family to this town. And I don't trust anyone else with old wood. Most contractors out here just want to tear it all out. They don't respect the material. He gestured to the dusty back corner of the shop, where a stack of antique leather-bound books sat precariously. She didn't want this place safe. She wanted it preserved. There's a difference. I was struck by the intensity of his quiet conviction. He wasn't just a fire chief. He was a craftsman. Where do you even do this work? I have a shop, he admitted, looking slightly uncomfortable with the question. The Sawdust and Spindle. It's just outside of town. It's my quiet place. The vulnerability of the answer, a rare crack in the chief tanner facade, pulled Evie in. She realized this man who lived and breathed rigid public responsibility had a sanctuary where he could create. Jake, she said softly, moving past the structural debt and the fear of exposure, I need to talk to you about the festival, the short story contest. He folded his arms, signaling his attention was split between the literary arts and structural beams. I need a judge, Evie stated. A local who understands the tales of the timber theme, someone who can't be easily swayed by a sob story or a fancy literary degree. Someone honest, practical, and who respects the integrity of wood. His lips twitched. It wasn't a smile, but it was close enough that Evie's heart did a strange little skip. You think a fire chief knows anything about stories, Evie? I think a man who reads roofing pamphlets like scripture and builds things out of wood understands structure, truth, and foundations. You're the perfect judge. You're the gatekeeper of Havenwood Creek's identity, Chief. He stared at her for a long moment, his steady gaze searching hers, as if trying to discern the exact angle of her literary pitch. Fine, he finally agreed, the word firm and definitive. But no celebrity judges, and no one wins for simply mentioning the word flannel. Evie let out a small, relieved breath, allowing a genuine smile to surface. It's a deal, Chief. Now, how about I repay you for your joist work with one of those life-threatening B specials, on the house? Jake finally cracked a genuine small smile, a rare shift in his face that transformed his severity into something deeply appealing. I appreciate the offer, but I'm trying to preserve my internal infrastructure too. Just water, please. And next time, try not to stack the books so high that you put another lateral load on the compromised walls. As he turned and descended back into the darkness beneath the floorboards, Evie watched the sawdust settle where he'd stood. He was right about the structural compromise, but she suspected the greatest threat to her carefully constructed, New York-approved internal structure wasn't the floorboards. It was the man currently reinforcing them. 2 weeks into her accidental residency, Evie was learning that operating the crooked spine was less like running a New York editorial office and more like managing a temperamental, high-maintenance museum dedicated to the concept of clutter. The coffee sales were funding the paper towels, and the short story contest, thanks to a few local bulletin board notices approved by Jake's strict $5 budget, had garnered exactly 3 submissions, 2 poems about rain and 1 6-page treatise on the superiority of hemlock over Douglas fir. Evie was currently tackling the rare and restricted section, which was less a section and more a barricade of locked ancient wooden crates in the back storage room. She suspected B had been hoarding first editions, or more likely, extremely volatile artisanal cheese. The largest crate, secured with a rusted padlock and labeled crudely with a smudge of lipstick, proved to be the toughest barrier. She was wrestling with a crowbar when Jake walked in, precisely at his scheduled time of 4 p.m., the dedicated hour they'd blocked out for literary oversight and structural repair. He was carrying a clipboard containing the 3 contest entries. "You're using improper leverage," he stated immediately, walking over and easily taking the crowbar from her hands. "You'll strain your rotator cuff. This is a job for focused, sustained pressure." He was close enough that Evie could smell the faint scent of fresh sawdust and pine sap clinging to his shirt, a much nicer smell than the mildew she normally inhabited. "I appreciate the lecture on structural mechanics, Chief. I'm just trying to liquidate B's bizarre collection of whatever is in here." Jake inserted the tip of the crowbar into the seam, applying pressure with slow, deliberate force. "Before you liquidate anything, we need to review these submissions. I have concerns about the judging criteria." "What concerns?" "Criteria 3, emotional resonance reflecting the spirit of Havenwood Creek. This 6-page essay on lumber superiority, while meticulously footnoted, lacks emotional resonance," Jake said, not breaking concentration as the wood started to groan. "It has passion," Evie argued, rubbing her wrist. "Passion counts." "No, Evie," Jake said, his voice low, the effort tightening the muscles in his forearms. "It has facts. We're looking for structure and soul, not a bibliography." Crack! The lock snapped and the heavy lid of the crate flew open. Evie leaned forward, expecting antique porcelain or perhaps a collection of rare, first-edition classics. She found neither. Inside the crate, cushioned by layers of tissue paper, were hundreds of crisp, untouched hardcover books. They were starkly modern, with a glossy, pretentious cover design that screamed big city publishing. The title stared up at her in metallic copper foil, The Last Testament of Amelia Frost. Evie felt all the air rush out of her lungs. The blood drained from her face, leaving her suddenly cold in the damp room. This was her book, the spectacular, high-profile failure that had ended her career, the book she had sworn she would never see, touch, or think about again. Aunt Bee had ordered a crate of them. Jake didn't look at the title. He noticed only Evie's sudden total stillness. He turned, his professional severity instantly replaced by a sharp, focused alarm. "Evie, what is it? Did something bite you?" Evie reached into the crate with a trembling hand and pulled out one of the books, turning it over to look at the jacket copy she had personally written. The Evelyn Monroe name was printed right there, in bold, on the editor's dedication page. "This is it," she whispered, her voice sounding foreign in her own ears. "This is the book that brought me here." Jake looked from the book to her face, slowly connecting the dots. His expression hardened not with judgment, but with confusion. "The one you edited? What's the problem? It looks brand new." Evie squeezed her eyes shut, wishing the floorboards would finally give way and swallow her whole. "The problem, Chief, is the structure, the core integrity. This book, this literary enterprise was a lie. The author plagiarized the entire thing from obscure, untranslated journals. I missed it. I championed it. I was responsible. When the news broke, it didn't just ruin the author, it ruined me." She shoved the book back into the crate, turning away to face the dusty wall. The shame she had locked away for months was a sudden, fresh, raw wound. "That's why I'm here, Jake. That's the real reason I'm in Havenwood Creek. I didn't come here for a vacation. I came here to hide from my failure, wait for the dust to settle, and sell this mess before anyone found out." The silence was heavier than the old timber beam. Evie expected him to look at her with the same disappointment he reserved for budget overruns and code violations. Instead, Jake moved slowly, taking the book Evie had touched and setting it gently on the edge of the crate. He didn't offer a platitude or a hug. He just spoke, his voice quiet and low. "The integrity of a structure," he said, staring at the book's glossy cover, "is defined not by how well it stands in the beginning, but by how it's reinforced after a load-bearing failure." He finally looked at her, his eyes serious and intent. "You came to hide, But you're running a business, you're trying to fix this disaster of a building, and you're trying to fix our festival. That's not hiding, Evie. That's rebuilding the foundation. He walked over to the table where the contest submissions lay. Now, if you're done hiding what brought you here, let's address the lack of emotional resonance in this hemlock essay. We have a profitable festival to build, and that starts with truth, not secrets. Evie swallowed past the lump in her throat. She had told him everything, the humiliating, career-ending failure, and the formidable, reserved man had simply framed it as a structural problem that required repair. It was the most understanding response she could have possibly received. A genuine, fragile smile touched her lips. "Fine, Chief, but if you're going to be my emotional carpenter, I need you to be honest. Does the Be Special coffee really taste like regret?" Jake picked up the hemlock essay. "It tastes like the kind of stubbornness that refuses to fail. Now," he topped the essay, "where's the metaphor in a Douglas fir?"
3 weeks out from Evie's arrival, the weather in Havenwood Creek performed its only real variation, moving from a heavy atmospheric mist to a slightly lighter, optimistic drizzle. Evie and Jake met at the Timber Festival grounds, a large, sodden clearing bordered by dense stands of towering Douglas fir. The space was currently marked by rusted fencing, a disused log-rolling pond that looked distinctly swampy, and the skeletal remains of last year's concession stands. "This is not a festival ground," Evie declared, pulling her waterproof jacket tighter around herself. "This is an ecosystem. Are we sure we can run a professional event here, or should we just sell tickets to watch the local flora evolve?" Jake, who seemed entirely impervious to the cold and damp, was already walking the perimeter, clipboard in hand. "It's tradition, it's stable, the subsoil compaction is reliable for the heavier equipment. And Evie, this is where the people of Havenwood Creek come to remember." Evie followed him across the muddy field. "Remember what? How much money they lost?" "No," Jake said, stopping near a massive, moss-covered stump that seemed to serve as a makeshift podium. "They remember why they're here. The Timber Festival isn't just a party, it's a tribute. My father ran this festival for 30 years. He believed this was the heart of the town." The air around Jake felt heavy. Evie knew from the planning documents that his father had died in a logging accident, but she hadn't connected it directly to the festival grounds until now. The rigidity and control Jake prized weren't just about safety, they were about grief. "Look," Evie said, softening her tone. "To make the contest work, we need a focal point, something sturdy that draws people in. A literary booth made of flimsy plywood won't cut it. It needs to look like it was grown here." "A booth that looks grown here," Jake mused, turning the concept over in his mind. "A display stand for the short stories, something that honors the wood." Evie nodded eagerly. "Exactly! I have a name for the coffee and scones. The Crooked Grind. It's literary, it's local, it's funny. We can charge $5 a cup. You need a service counter and a display case. I have the perfect supply of salvaged cedar at my shop. Come with me. We can design the build on site." And just like that, Evie was invited into Jake's world. 5 minutes later, they were parked at a secluded, unmarked turnoff on the edge of the forest. Tucked away behind a screen of old growth was a large, beautifully weathered cedar building with wide bay doors. The Sawdust and Spindle. The moment Jake rolled up the bay doors, Evie understood why he was so protective of this place. It was a cathedral of wood. The air was warm, dry, and rich with the aroma of freshly cut pine, oiled walnut, and old leather. Tools, chisels, planes, sanders were arrayed on racks with the meticulous precision of a surgical theater. This was Jake's true self, organized, focused, and deeply, undeniably artistic. "Wow," Evie breathed, walking past stacks of lumber that seemed too beautiful to cut. "This is incredible, Jake. This is—" "My sanctuary," he finished, his voice hushed. He seemed to drop the fire chief persona like a heavy coat, replacing it with the quiet intensity of a craftsman. I come here to stop being the chief. I come here to build things that last. He led her to a massive workbench. On one end were the tools he used for Evie's structural repairs. On the other, covered carefully with a linen sheet, was a project he was clearly treating with reverence. I need a blueprint for the literary booth. Evie pointed to a smooth slab of maple. Something about 4 feet wide, with a shelf for the submissions, and a small counter for the coffee machine. Jake pulled out a pencil, and within minutes he was sketching. He didn't use a ruler. His lines were perfectly straight, his measurements instinctive. "We can use a live-edge cedar slab for the main counter," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "It'll look like the story is growing right out of the word. And the display case, a simple shadow box, hinged for access with a locking mechanism." Evie leaned close, watching the easy movement of his hand. "A locking mechanism? Are you expecting literary espionage?" "I'm expecting Havenwood Creek," he retorted, a rare, genuine spark of humor in his eyes. "Someone will try to rig the contest for their grandson." While Jake finalized the structural sketches, Evie's gaze drifted to the covered project. The corner of the linen sheet had slipped, revealing a glimpse of highly polished wood, dark, rich cherry, carved into a smooth, elegant curve. It was clearly a piece of fine furniture, miles away from a simple structural beam. "What is that?" Evie asked softly, walking closer. Jake's movements instantly became guarded. He moved quickly and pulled the linen back down, covering the piece completely. "That's nothing," he said, too quickly. "It's just a project." "It didn't look like nothing," Evie pressed gently. "It looked like something you put your heart into. I've worked with writers, Jake. I know the difference between a project and a piece of your soul." Jake sighed, running a tired hand through his hair, the sawdust catching the harsh workshop light. He looked out the bay doors, toward the forest. "It's a hope chest," he admitted, his voice barely audible over the hum of the dehumidifier. "For my mother. My father was supposed to build it. He had the cherry wood set aside for years. He never finished it. The day of the accident, he was out inspecting the new logging course for the festival. He thought the log lift was safe, but the cable snapped." Evie felt a familiar, sharp ache, the feeling of a massive, critical failure. Jake's loss was heavy, immediate, and tragically public. "You finish it every year, don't you?" Evie realized, the words sinking in slowly. "You keep running the festival perfectly, because if you control every detail, if you make it profitable and safe, you prove that his sacrifice wasn't for nothing." Jake didn't deny it. He just looked at her, his river-colored eyes dark with unspoken pain. "Chaos costs lives, Evie. My life is about structure now. It has to be." "I understand," Evie whispered. For the first time, she truly did. Her chaos had ruined a book. His chaos had cost him his father. Their opposing philosophies stemmed from the same devastating fear of failure. Evie reached out and lightly touched the cool, smooth wood of the workbench. "The crooked grind literary booth will have perfect structure, Chief. It will be safe, profitable, and it will honor the memory of the wood." Jake nodded slowly, a small flicker of trust passing between them. He picked up the cedar slab. "Good. Let's make something real, Evie. Something that lasts longer than a scandal." He grabbed a specialized tool, a block plane, and pulled it across the cedar, creating a curl of beautifully scented, gossamer-thin wood. For a moment, the chief was gone, and there was only the craftsman. Evie leaned in, captivated by the easy, practiced strength of his movements. The sawdust, the warmth, and the shared secret felt more like a home than her damp apartment ever could.